I'm Nancy Macy. I'm the current chair of the Valley Women's Club's Environmental Committee for the San Lorenzo Valley. Well, I wasn't going to cry, but I'm going to, so thank you. We're so lucky because this event is being filmed by Community TV, and luckily, one of our most active members on the Environmental Committee, Jennifer Parks, is also a Community TV volunteer. So Jen, thank you for being here. We'll try to get the word out to you when it's online and when it's going to be scheduled for Community TV, but it will also be online, like YouTube or something fun like that. So if you did put your name on the sign-in sheet, we'll definitely let you know one way or the other, and otherwise it'll be through word of mouth and, you know, all the good local newspapers. We have our Valley Press representative, Pat Dwyer, here today. Grateful for his coming and covering this event. First, regrettably, we did this last year. It's important to say we're grateful for the amazing fire departments that serve the San Lorenzo Valley. And of course, they just drove by with sirens blazing, so think the thoughts south. We were really lucky in Boulder Creek yesterday. There was no wind. They were there very rapidly, and my husband is standing watching as the big tanker flies overhead and, you know, literally ducking because they're just scraping over the tops of the trees and dumping it where it needs to go. So we're very, very lucky. So I was going to say join me in a round of applause, but you did it already. Spontaneous is best. You know, as always, rain or shine or smoke, we live in the most beautiful place in the world. You know, sorry. We all cherish the fact we live here. And it's really exciting to have so many people come and enjoy the 19th annual Environmental Town Hall. This has been a tradition, and it's just pretty amazing that for the last 19 years, whoever has been our state assembly member has been willing to come, in fact, eager and happy to come. So we're really lucky who we have now representing us in the state legislature. But before we go any further, I want you to know that today's event is held in honor. Oh shit, sorry. You'll edit that out, right? One of the most remarkable stewards of the environment died, Fred McPherson. Thousands of people in his community share his family's grief at his passing. Fred was a scientist. He knew science and how it worked. He was a teacher, a mentor, a community activist, and of course a wonderful husband, father, grandfather, and friend. He served as a skilled and thoughtful member of the San Lorenzo Valley Water District Board for many years. You think it was contentious now? It's been around for a while. He organized the Santa Cruz Mountains Institute. Google that. He was a board member with the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council. Google that. He worked hard during elections, and he knew when they were important to the community. You can find he has a blog, which he published at each equinox or solstice. Hundreds of his UCSC and local students and the parents of his students have joined in reaching out to tell their stories when they heard he had passed away. And what inspiration and joy that he brought to their lives, and knowledge and understanding. Recently, for the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, he and Roberta have been researching, filming, editing, and narrating these incredible videos. The two most recent were on Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. Brilliant. And most recently, the Turkey Foot, which is Fall Creek Park. And they're beautiful. And they're also extremely informative. You'll just be surprised at how much geology, geography, you know, Botany, biology is in these, and you flow with them and their beauty. So you'll find them at Henry Cowell Park, by the way, if you want to own your own copy. And I believe that SLV Water District has them online.
Yeah, we have copies at the office.
And copies at the office, okay. So I can't begin to express how much we will miss his wisdom, and especially his gentle and peaceful spirit. In his honor and memory, please take what you learned today home with you to share with neighbors, to share with family, to share with friends, and apply it to your lives and make our valley a better place. There's a lot to learn here today, as you've begun to see by the wonderful organizations around the table, around the room. And I hope you will take more time after we're done with the main part of the program to continue, in case you didn't get to visit them all, the high school students out there with their extraordinary programs. But I want to invite the person who actually invited all these groups to come. She's going to give you a little information about them. And Kirsten Hill, come on up.
Such an amazing turnout. Thank you guys so much for coming. This is fantastic. I'm really excited to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. I really want to turn the spotlight over to all the exhibitors that we have here today. We have so many, and it's just fabulous that we have so many people that are so enthusiastic and so full of knowledge and resources that can help us here in the Valley. I'm struggling with this microphone.
Take it out of it.
It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, just hold it like this. So please do take the time to visit with them after the talk, if you haven't already. We have people here working everything from native plants to air quality to transportation to our water quality and our water supply. We have high school students here who are doing monitoring in our valley. We have people working in our parks and volunteers that are working to protect the environment and protect our parks. So I just want to mention their names and the folks that are here briefly. We have the California Conservation Corps with Nicholas Signoretti. We have the California Native Plant Society, the Santa Cruz County chapter with Linda Broadman and Ann Garside. We have the City of Santa Cruz Water District with Angela Richmond and Nick Redford. The Coastal Watershed Council with Laurel Lee. Friends of the Felton Library with Nancy Gert. Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks with Jorge Zavala. Henry Cowell State Park, Brian Diller. Monterey Bay Air Resources Board, Amore Bertrode. The Mountain Parks Foundation, we have Tom Roth and Aaron Bush. San Lorenzo Valley High School, our future environmental leaders, the environmental monitoring class. Stephanie Beck is in charge of this class. And the students that we have are Celeste Robinson, Catherine McCormick, Natalie Owen, Trevor Cameron, Ning Turluzzi, sorry about the pronunciation there, Simone Sutton, Ruby Howard, Chris Anderson, Katie Logier. Please welcome them. San Lorenzo Valley Caregiver Support Group, we have Barbara Hansen. San Lorenzo Valley Native Habitat Restoration Program, we have Linda Skeff. San Lorenzo Valley Water District, we have Jen Michelson and Carly Blanchard. The Santa Cruz Birding Club, Lisa Sheridan. Santa Cruz County Fisheries and Environmental Health, we have Kirsten Kittleson. Santa Cruz County Parks, we have Dan Lazarus. Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission, we have Brianna Goodman. Santa Cruz Climate Action Network, Pauline Seals. Santa Cruz County Vector Control, Nader Sidhorn. At Santa Cruz Sierra Club, Jane Mio. And of course, the Valley Women's Club of San Lorenzo Valley, Nancy Macy. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yeah, for sure. That was great. Wow. Do you realize how many people put their lives and souls and spirits into the environment in this area? And other wonderful things that are really important, like libraries and actually how we can get up and down Highway 9 safely, right over here. So, and what work is being done. So how lucky we are. Most of you are well aware that we have an effective and knowledgeable leader in the State Assembly. Mark Stone and his staff are very responsive to the concerns brought to him daily, and he has always been ready to delve into some of the most complex and far-reaching of the financial, social, and environmental issues facing our state. He lives in Scotts Valley. He first served 2 terms as our 5th District Supervisor. He did a great job locally, and it led to his election to the Assembly, where he has demonstrated his leadership in many areas, including the environmental protection and child welfare issues. Mark was just re-elected this month. Yay! This is his 4th term. We are very, very lucky to have him. He really has a lot of commitments. Throughout his district, many demands on his time, and his staff is extraordinarily busy. Happily, he's very good at what he does, and so he makes time to listen and support the San Lorenzo Valley, its watershed, its residents, and keeps them in mind while working on legislation in Sacramento and responding to statewide needs as well as local needs. After his comments, we'll have a Q&A. And if you have a question, if you are comfortable and able to do so, please stand up to give your question. Mark will repeat it so that for sure everybody, including the TV, can hear it. So be patient with that process, and thank you, Mark. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Nancy. I was amused at her comment that all the legislators come here sort of willingly and happily, because as you all know, when Nancy says, "Would you come?" it means you will be there, and Brooks, no question or... That's better. So it's one of those voluntold kind of things. Because when Nancy says come, of course, we're going to come. But it's always been good to come and talk about environmental issues. And I guess it takes PG&E to get people excited about the environment, because they clearly are not. And I know that's why a lot of folks are here. But I want to start kind of macro and some other things going on in the state, and then work our way down to closer stuff. And we'll definitely talk about PG&E and the broader context of what's going on. But first of all, it's nice of Nancy to mention Fred, and I know our friends Fred and Roberta, and they're really struggling now since we lost him recently. I think we all have learned a lot from him, and his clear science-based approach, which seems to be missing in a lot of discourse, especially as you go to the other side of this great land, where they more want to deny science than utilize it on a day-to-day basis. And science and politics is always interesting in how we bring science to bear in the political environment, and sometimes it works well, sometimes not so much. But in California, we're doing a lot more. And in fact, where the federal government has been stepping back in a number of different areas, including on climate change, I gave California and our governor, Jerry Brown, the ability to step into the worldwide stage. And we recently had a climate action conference. jurisdictions in California. And he declared it partly because the federal government, which should have been the ones convening, but it was just a state. We're a subnational jurisdiction. We are not a national jurisdiction, but we had countries from around the world coming to this climate action conference. And the point of the climate action conference was to commit to what you as a jurisdiction are going to do to help solve the problems, the significant problems that we know we're facing. And there were a number of countries and individuals who got to stand up and speak in the main forum, and they could only speak and they could only represent their jurisdiction if they had that commitment. They had to make a commitment, then they could go and say whatever else they wanted to do. And it's that commitment that's going to help most significantly, because even though California has been able to pass some pretty good policies around what we do to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions and how we start to think about adapting to the changing environment because of greenhouse gas emissions, we can't do it alone. We are a small part. And whether you're talking about plastics going into the ocean, about the ocean absorbing all the carbon and starting to acidify in major systems around the world that we rely on day to day, the ocean is a source of half the oxygen that we breathe. And it is absorbing carbon because that's what it's designed to do. And it will be here, even though as it's absorbing carbon, it's changing in a way that may not allow us to survive in the same way that we're surviving right now. That's the scary part of it. And the UN, through its science, has said, well, it's not 2 degrees Celsius, it's about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we might need to be taking action within 12 years, which is a much shorter timeline than a lot of jurisdictions had planned. So this was what the conversation was. And it was remarkable to see California as the one all these other countries were thanking for convening. And the message to us was, California is famous for exporting innovation. The technology, that's what people think of. And there's a lot more to California than just the technology, but that's a big part of it. But what they were specifically asking is that we export leadership. And so we have been trying to do that. Some good, some experimental, but we've now committed to 100% renewables in the energy sector. We have committed to increasing the electric vehicle fleet. We're really pushing on storage, which is now the conversation when you talk about solar. You have to have storage as a part of it so that we can even out how that energy is collected and distributed around. Those kinds of commitments and getting away from fossil fuels and to sustainable types of energy solutions, the Monterey Bay Power, the community choice aggregations that are starting to crop up around California are very significant parts of how California is going to meet those goals. That's what we got to talk about. And for the first time in the climate action context, we put oceans on the forefront. All the other conversations did not address oceans. Now, most everybody that I mentioned this to say, well, how could that be? How could that be? Because oceans are obviously a very significant part of the systems that we need that are being affected by the amount of carbon going in the atmosphere, but we need to be thinking about them and how we interact and interrelate with those oceans. It had never been. It is now completely a part of that conversation and the commitments. That California, Oregon, and Washington had started an ocean acidification task force. And then we added Hawaii, we added Fiji, we added a few other jurisdictions, and after the Climate Action Summit, we now have a couple dozen, going on 3 dozen, jurisdictions around the world who are signed on, committed to help solve this problem, because again, as the ocean chemistry changes, that's not something one jurisdiction can solve. Even if we did the best we could, it's not going to make much of a dent unless there are many other jurisdictions around the oceans, even inland, who are going to participate in the solutions that we're seeing. So that's California. I sit on the Ocean Protection Council, and we've recently done some pretty significant guidelines around sea level rise, some very significant guidelines which just passed a couple months ago around ocean acidification, and the kinds of things we need to be looking at in how we start to address those changes, and to some extent how we head off the worst of those changes, or what do we do as those changes get really significant. As far as environmental policy goes, and I get to talk in general about other environmental policy, I think the legislature does not yet have quite such a good record. We did do a bill around single-use plastic straws. But it's sit-down restaurants and it's voluntary only, but it's a step in the right direction. And the amusing thing about that is I was talking to some folks in the media and they talk about it as a straw ban. And it's not really a straw ban. But the more they talk about it as a straw ban, the more people think that that's what we did. And so they act like we have a ban. And a lot of young folks who are here today should react if a straw is offered to them. Wait a minute, why are you doing that? And a number of different companies are participating or are trying to figure out a way to get away from single-use plastic straws. And I love McDonald's. Not really. That's what but at least they committed to get away from plastic straws. And so they are now going to be offering these paper straws. But of course they're handed to you wrapped in plastic. So it's good news, it's bad news, but we're sort of getting there. We tried to address some of the other plastic pollution that, along with the bottle law in California, we have a very significant problem with bottle caps coming off of single-use bottles. So I proposed this little thing that, oh my gosh, you'd have thought I was trying to end the entire soda industry. There's a thought. Well, never mind. Because this is such an imposition on them to require them to figure out how to actually tether the lid to the bottle so that when the bottle comes back, the lids come back. And they did not react very well to this. They sort of fought that. And what they went around to my colleagues saying, don't vote for this because what Stone really wants to do is to ban single-use plastic bottles. And I had to say, yeah, that's not what this bill is about. But that's the fear that they created. In fact, I love my constituents. People around the Monterey Bay. When I proposed that, the single biggest criticism I got out of the district from you was leaching the lids. Why don't you just ban single-use plastic bottles? Okay, I get that. You are far ahead of what Sacramento is going to be willing to do, because just even talking about leaching the lid, which all of the major bottling companies are in fact working on, they just don't want to admit to it. In fact, we had sort of an amusing hearing in the Senate on that bill, or I'm sorry, not in the Senate, but in committee on that bill. It never got to the Senate. But in committee, because the bottle industry was sitting there saying, well, this is impossible, nobody can do this. The standard you're setting is impossible. When we're talking about water bottles, we're talking about soda bottles, carbonated bottles and all that. And here comes Crystal Geyser and puts on the table a bottle that they are currently distributing around California and around the world with, what do you know, the lid attached. So they had to adjust and change their story a little bit. Funny how this goes in light of the reality that was in front of them. But here's the power of money and lobbying and influence. They had the CEO of CG Roxanne, who is the parent company of Crystal Geyser, at the table talking about this. And then before we got to the next hearing on this, he had to call up and say, look, I still support your bill, but I can't be there anymore. His trade association and his colleagues got to him and said, don't do that to us. So he stepped away from being a witness. And I would often show up to hearings or other offices with examples of bottles with lids leashed just to overcome this impossibility argument, but a lot of my colleagues still believe in the possibility, in the impossibility argument. Can't do that. Well, we will get there. But that's a little bit of sort of how things go. So we haven't done that well in other things other than sort of the top level climate change kinds of policies, which we've been able to push. And a lot of it because Jerry Brown, bless Jerry Brown, won't take no for an answer. When he's on something, he is on something. And in fact, one of the things, and a little tangent from the environmental piece of it, but he wanted us to pass the cap and trade. Cap and trade, as you know, was a program put in place by executive order, so it didn't have the strength of having legislative authority behind it, and especially the 2/3, so he wanted a 2/3 vote out of it. And he came to the Assembly and we said, wait a minute, we've been trying to get your attention on housing for years. We kept putting large asks on the table in the budget context, and he kept saying, no, 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 we won't do that. I said, all right, you want cap and trade? We're going to do housing. That's how we got the housing bond. That's how we got the document transfer fee on documents. So we were able to step a little bit into that realm because he wanted something we got something out of it and broadened the conversation. Because for us, we're trying to work on a number of different facets all the time. That's what we do in the legislature. And we keep wanting to spend some money, and this governor has not wanted to spend money. But we still have we have very healthy budgets and a very healthy situation in California right now. In fact, it's the only reason that we're able to, that plus the federal money we'll draw down for the wildfires that are currently burning, that's the only reason that we have some ability to manage the resource constraint. Although I will say last year, 2017, we were literally one fire away from not having enough personnel and equipment to go fight that next fire. We were at that point, which is a little scary. So we put some things in place now to try and put us in a better situation. Plus our reserves are such that we will be able to draw down some of that money. Although California, we're sitting on a lot of reserves. In fact, we have more reserves than I think it's 38 states have general fund in their states. So California, California is a very big state, a very complicated state, and we have a lot of needs. And the last economic downturn we had was devastating on local jurisdictions, counties and cities, because a lot of the programs that especially the counties implement, the state was shortchanging because they didn't have money. Because the state's general fund is primarily driven on income taxes, sales taxes, and things that are very volatile in a volatile economy. So they don't rely on some of the more stable revenues. That will always be a challenge. And we're the only state that funds the K-14 system mostly entirely out of the state's general fund. So we have some very serious constraints. But even in that, we've been able to make investments in significant areas, parts of our community. My frustration, I chair the Legislative Environmental Caucus, and we talk a lot about the environmental policy that we can move through, what we can't move through, how we're going to be able to collect the votes. Because in the legislature, this is all about votes. Although, one of the interesting artifacts about the current administration and the pressure being put on Congress to turn from Republican Congress to a Democratic Congress, we had last session, 55 Democrats, 54 is the supermajority. As it looks right now, we're going to have 60 Democrats. Which is interesting. Those of you who've heard me talk about it, the supermajority is a bit of a mixed bag. But with this many above the supermajority, I'm hoping we can use that a little bit more thoughtfully and carefully, and use it to some effect rather than having to do kind of the backroom deals and the trade-offs that always happen once we try to get that last vote on something that is 2/3. Although very little goes to the legislature ultimately on a 2/3 vote. So that frustration with what's happening in Washington affected the state assembly and is affecting local races across California. I think we're seeing that in the results, and especially in areas that were traditionally much more Republican-oriented than Democratic-oriented. Not true around here. I think the majorities are very, very consistent, and that's why you get to push me on things that are pretty good. So those are kind of some of the highlights, the higher end of stuff that we've done. And I know a lot of you want to talk about PG&E. I'm going to talk about kind of what happened last year and leading up to where we are today, which I think bears on what we're seeing. And it breaks my heart to think that there are 1,000 people in the Camp Fire still missing. There are 700 deaths and some horrific stories. I'm sorry, 7. Yeah, 1,000. It was 700 missing, 70 deaths. It's now 1,000 missing, 70 deaths. Thank you. Misplaced to 0.
Don't do that.
And it's, well, see, that's my problem, is we're always asking for more. But so last year, after the 2017 fires, which were catastrophic, and people were not expecting this year to have now the largest, the deadliest fire. We had that last year, and we have that again this year. And if you don't think this is driven by changes in the climate, then you're not actually paying attention to what's been happening and how things are happening. And we are going to see winters with more rain than we're used to, and with water at different times, which means erosion, which means flooding. There are things that we're going to have to deal with that we hadn't before, and the hot, dry weather that we see, and the high winds. are all artifacts of this, because the jet stream is moving a little bit further north, which is changing all this. And I was reading a report on desert tortoise habitat, and they're predicting desert tortoise habitat to get up into the southern part of the Salinas Valley. Whoa. Yeah, what does that mean? Well, that means deserts, right? That means dry. That means agriculture in California south of that is less viable in a few years than it had been a few years ago. So if we think things aren't changing, things are definitely changing. So after the fires in 2017, PG&E being PG&E, and I know this is about PG&E and we will talk about this, but it's really should be about investor-owned utilities. But we have some good actors and good examples, and we have some bad actors and some bad examples. And PG&E falls in that latter category, and they just seem to be driven to do that. And they came to the legislature saying, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, and we're going to have to declare bankruptcy. And this was March, April of last year, because they were potentially on the hook for $10 to $15 billion worth of damages. Now, the investor-owned utilities sit in an interesting place in California law, because they're a private company, but they have a lot of the benefits and attributes of a public agency. So they sit sort of between the two, which is why the condemnation rules, the inverse condemnation rules, apply to them. And if they're at fault at all in a fire, as any municipal agency would be, then they're 100% liable for the outcome. And what all that really is a mechanism to get money into the hands of the people who have been damaged by the fire, the flood, whatever that had been caused. It's a way of having communities recover. So it's a mechanism that's been around a long time. They also have the benefit of being in that sort of quasi-public agency because they get cheap access to money. If they don't get cheap access to money, then our rates all go up because they can get loans that other organizations, private organizations, cannot get loans. Municipal agencies, counties, cities can get loans much more cheaply than other organizations. PG&E has that benefit. So they've got all of this structure because they sit there, but they came to the legislature and they wanted out from underneath the liability piece. They want the benefit, yes. They don't want the detriment. And they had created enough panic that they almost had the votes to do that. But we slowed them down. We slowed them down. And I think what they wanted to do was get a decision made before CAL FIRE's report came out in June. Because that report was going to show where they were liable. And the liability question is never that clear, but it's either a fire had started because of a failure in their equipment or it was exacerbated by some failure in their equipment, and they contributed to it. And the way the law is if they contributed at all, then they're entirely liable for it. And there was, when we talked to the insurance companies who were insuring everybody, because that's the first line of defense with the insurance companies, to the extent people have fire insurance, which is a huge question, it will be now an even bigger question come next year and year after that, and we're going to have to work with the insurance companies to make sure people can get fire coverage. So PG&E wanted to change that liability question, and the insurance companies were saying, no, we can handle this. PG&E has actually enough assets that we can handle this, which was good news. Things are a little bit different now, because last year's fires were $10 to $15 billion. This year's fires, that much or more. And it's probably 3 or 4 times the market cap of the company. So when we go back into session come January, we've got some difficult questions to answer about how we make sure everybody, so that we manage this energy distribution infrastructure and to keep the lights on, to keep things moving, but also make sure that that infrastructure is the best it can be to avoid starting the fires. Now in the good actor category, or better actor category, is San Diego Gas and Electric, who had been held liable for the fires in San Diego a number of years ago. And what was their response? Their response was to harden their lines, was to change the kind of wiring and equipment that they used to minimize the ignition source or the continued transmission source of a fire as it moved through. And so they did that investment because they realized they couldn't afford not to make that investment. PG&E, however, seems to want to take the cheapest route, just sort of the path of least resistance, cut all the trees, and not really address the infrastructure that they have. So we've been trying to push the PUC. And what this all ended up with was we forestalled the question of removing the liability from PG&E. But the PUC came to the legislature, and this was in a category of rather irritating. Because what we did in the Senate Bill 901, which was a conference bill, which means it was negotiated between the two houses in a separate committee and then brought to us on the floor, the Senate and the Assembly at the same time, for an up or down vote. And it did a number of things. It's not the bailout that a lot of people are afraid of. It's far from it, although PG&E is still back wanting that bailout. They're going to want that next step. But for the 2017 fires, there was a process set up to really look at what their fault was, their ability to kind of cover the liability that's coming up. And if not, then so it would really end up being a split between shareholders and ratepayers. So rates are going to start to go up. But if a company goes into bankruptcy, if the company doesn't have access to the cheap money, if the company doesn't have those other structures, rates are going to go up anyway. So we're trying to manage impacts on ratepayers and hold PG&E liable. And the mechanism to do that is going to force PG&E to, oh my gosh, kind of open up their books and give us a better sense of how all of this works within the company, which is something that they haven't wanted to do. For the 2018 fire, so the bill addresses the 2017 fires and then takes effect come January 1. So the 2018 fires are not covered at all. And we have now had some very, very significant fires. That's going to be significant cost. And I have to wait till the CAL FIRE report comes out. But it seems that PG&E will probably have some level of responsibility in there. So for the 2019 and going forward, and this is the part that's a little bit irritating because the PUC could have done all of this on its own, but they refused to. So they came to the legislature and said, you need to do this for us. Well, they're the ones who supposedly have the expertise. They're the ones who have the staff who understands this and puts all this together, but instead they came to us. And why did they come to us? Because of the political ability of companies like PG&E to manipulate the legislature. And this was what I'm a little bit worried about going into next year. We were able, I think, to head off some of the worst of it. And so SB 901 addresses the fire liability question in a little bit better of a way. Although now, because 2018 fires are not covered by it, I'm not sure what we're going to have to do. And we'll see what Governor-elect Newsom is going to want to do come in the new year, because it's his agencies that have to implement all this. And the other part of it had to do with forestry management. We've been trying to get some of the greenhouse gas reduction funds to apply to actually managing our forests in a better way, because they're burning in a way that they weren't designed to burn. And for all of the, I'm reminded, years ago somebody came to me, one of the forestry companies, and said, you realize that there's more forested land in California now than there was 50 years ago. Maybe, but I think that's a bit of misinformation, because if you look at what happens when they clear cut, then they plant again. All of those trees are now the same size, same diameter. They function more like row crops than like a forest, and this is the problem. Because forests are designed to be able to burn and recover. But when they're treated more like row crops, and we're not managing that forest in the right way, they will burn exponentially, much hotter, much faster. And this is why the fire last year went into Santa Rosa. This is why the fire is going into areas that people hadn't seen before. It got to within a mile of Senator Dodd's house. And I was talking to him, he was absolutely flabbergasted because he lives in a very urbanized area. Could not imagine a forest fire coming into his area. This was all very brand new. And it's because of the speed and the heat of that fire moving through a poorly managed forest. And interestingly, in spite of the tweet storm, most of those forests that are poorly managed are federal forests. But oh well. So we've got some money that we can now bring to bear on forest management. And I know in this crowd this is a dicey thing to say, but the Forestry Board, which is actually constituted a little bit better than it was back when I was on the Board of Supervisors and we were really fighting with them again and again and again, is a little bit better constituted to make sure that when that money gets spent, that it gets spent to actually make those systems, the forest systems, function like forest systems. And one of the things that we've been trying to ward off is this notion, and this is a very popular notion in the legislature right now, is that if we allow people to cut more of their trees, they will then be able to raise the money, so the market trees, big trees, which aren't the fire problem, it's the small trees, it's the brush, it's the other pieces. If we allow them to cut more trees, the market rate trees, then they'll do the right thing and they'll clear their forests. Yeah, no they won't. They'll cut the trees, they'll keep the money, and they'll move on, and not have solved the ultimate problem. So if we're putting this money to good use, that good use means it has to be used to get the forests to function the way they were intended, right? Not just allow somebody to sell their market trees. But that's been one of the fights we've been able to head off a little bit to some extent, because there are certain exemptions that if a tree is small enough, somebody can cut it without a timber harvest plan. And that size keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's very destructive to exactly what we were talking about. It allows people to make money off their forests, fine. But if they're not going to be taking care of their forests with that money, then we're exacerbating the fire danger. We're not ultimately solving the problem. So as we head back in to next session, it's going to be kind of interesting because all of these forces are trying to go to the least, sort of doing what PG&E is doing, is go to the least common denominator and say, what's the simplest, most straightforward thing we can do? And what are they doing here? They're cutting the hell out of our forests because they're panicked about it, and that's not the right response. Look what SDG&E did. Look what Southern California Edison has done to a point. But SDG&E is a much better actor in this, is they have really hardened their facilities. And they've come up with plans to de-energize lines so that as a fire is coming through or fire danger is there, they'll de-energize. And what was PG&E's response? They sent thousands of people notices, we may de-energize your line. Not in a strategic way, but in this block way, and it's almost a matter of sort of a rude gesture to those of us who've been pushing them to do the right things because they don't really want to. And breaking through that corporate culture, all they want is a bailout and to be able to continue while they can. And the PUC right now does not seem to be willing to really push on them and to address that, which is why they came to the legislature in the first place. Because now they've essentially taken themselves off the hook for what it is we're trying to manage. But this can't be done without an effective PUC, and it really can't be done without understanding kind of all of those forces that are at bear. Or we're going to end up in a situation where people cannot get fire insurance. We're going to end up in a situation where there's not going to be the resources available to help communities recover. And we've got, Florida has a hurricane program that they put in place. And I'm not suggesting this, but it's an interesting program. Where all the there's a small fee on every single insurance policy that people get in the state of Florida on homeowners policies. That goes into a state fund, and that creates a state fund that then helps cover the gaps between what the insurance could cover and what the actual damage was. So it's an interesting thought. And in one of the hearings we had, one of my dear Republican colleagues who's sort of very out there actually uttered the words, well, we should be socializing these costs. Which was remarkable to me, and I avoided the temptation to say you're a socialist now. But yes, we're going to have to come up with a mechanism to make sure, to replace this, the way the inverse condemnation has happened before, to make sure that communities can in fact recover, and that there's capital available, that there are solutions available to get communities back together. I cannot imagine what's going to happen in Paradise. Although a year ago we were kind of in the same boat with Santa Rosa and some of these communities who didn't know how they were going to recover. They are in fact starting to recover. A lot of structures are being built, or being rebuilt, and a lot of the businesses are now kind of redoing. There were a lot of shopping malls, churches, schools that were affected. Paradise, it's kind of burned clear. And there's not a lot, we're talking 10,000 single-family units, 500 or more multifamily units. So the lack of the impact in that community and where those people go is going to be absolutely heart-rending as we try and kind of come out of this. So, what are we doing with PG&E? I've been working with, I thought Bruce might be here, because we're working closely with Bruce McPherson's office. And from my standpoint, from the state standpoint, it's really the state agencies who implement. So we've been kind of pushing on CAL FIRE. We've been pushing on even the federal agency of NOAA because they're responsible for overseeing the Endangered Species Act. And turns out, this will be a shock, but PG&E was ignoring the Endangered Species Act, was ignoring the permits that they were required to get before they do the cutting. They were in fact even ignoring the encroachment permits that the county normally requires for them to come onto public lands and be able to do the cutting that they're doing. And kind of bullying people into saying, no, you have to let us do this or we're going to shut off your power. Which they technically have the right to do, but will fully admit they won't do. But then why bully people? And we've talked to a lot of folks around the San Lorenzo Valley and actually other places who know enough to say, slow down, when we talk to a manager, this is what will work, this is what won't work, don't touch this, don't touch that. And then of course, especially on the public lands, they leave all the slash around. And I can remember when this happened before, and we actually got them to slow down. We got them to coordinate with the county. I remember how many years ago, this was a number of years ago, when they were on another sort of a gig of trying to cut as many trees as possible in their areas, got them to work with the county to give the county notice of where they were going in to cut. So that was a much more rational way, and then we could do public meetings, we could let people know what to expect and how to expect it. But that's not what they want to do. We've told them again and again and again, they need to come up. They had a community hearing in Aptos, but not here, because they're afraid of you. And for probably good reason. They don't want to deal with this. And I don't tend towards cynicism, but that part of me that does, I think that one of the reasons they're being so aggressive here is they knew at some point we were going to stop them and slow them down. And so they just came in with armies of tree cutters to get as much done as they possibly could. Until we got CAL FIRE to get them to slow down. But now CAL FIRE's issued those permits, and there are some significant questions around the language in that permits that we're trying to figure out and understand what that implication is. We got NOAA to finally pay some attention to this because of the impacts on habitat and endangered species, which is something I'm very valuable. Because PG&E actually can be responsible. They have to be, they must be responsible about how they manage their lines and their infrastructure to minimize fire danger, either the ignition or the transmission of fire as it goes through. But they don't seem to be ultimately willing to do that. And evidenced by the fact that they just overlooked the fact that they needed permits and didn't feel that they needed to do that this time around. So working with McPherson's office and the county, between state agencies and county agencies, we have some ability to push back somewhat and at least make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Once they do that though, once they get the permits, they're going to continue with doing what they're doing, and they're not going to be continuing with the infrastructure hardening, with the transmission line stuff, because they just don't, the information's there, the examples are there with other IOUs. And this was the tough part about the conference committee bill, because we were trying to do something for all IOUs, all investor-owned utilities, not just PG&E. And we have some good actors, and we have some bad actors. And for those better actors, like San Diego Gas and Electric, who were really trying to do the right things, we didn't want to put them in a position of where we were taking away their incentives to do the right thing, but still trying to hold PG&E a little bit more accountable to look to their southern neighbors and do something right. I can't even watch their ads anymore because the TV ads that they've been playing over this last year, they come on and they actually say, look at what we're doing for you. Well, where were you 10 years ago? 15 years ago. If they had done some of that 10 or 15 years ago, we would be in a better position now, but they haven't done it, they won't do that. And getting them to that point is going to be our challenge next year. But I can come and talk to you about this. And you can put pressure on me, fair, and we are getting a lot of calls. And I will tell you though, I'm also getting a lot of calls from constituents kind of worried about all this and asking me to push PG&E to do even more cutting. But it's not the cutting. It's the infrastructure management that they need to focus on. And we're going to keep pushing on that. But the caution that I have, and I'm not sure if I could harness your energy and your help, if I can figure out how to do that in a better way, I will rely on that. Because not all of my colleagues agree. Remember, last March or April, we had enough legislators panicked about PG&E's bankruptcy threat. Sky is falling threat. that they were almost ready to pull the trigger on her. So we had to get them slowed down. This notion of the cutting that they're doing right now actually resonates with a lot of my colleagues. That seems like a responsible step. So as we go into next year, I want to make sure that we kind of set up fights we can win on this, because what's at stake is so significant. And their response to it and our ability to hold their feet to the fire really depends on getting enough of the right votes. Because if the PUC is not going to take in that step, which they've shown in lack of willingness to do, one of the reasons they punted it to the legislature, where these kinds of policies get a lot more muddied and difficult to implement, then we're going to have to make sure that we're working with, and I have a number of more colleagues that represent rural areas. Some of whom understand this, some of whom don't, but we've got to build a stronger coalition to look at what's right in how we get this implementation done, as opposed to what's expedient, and kind of get out from underneath the panic that PG&E likes to engender. Because it's that when you have 120 individuals with decision-making authority, the more chaos you can create, and they're good at creating that, then they get the advantage of that. And that's sort of where we were headed last year. Unfortunately, we were able to head that off with a bill that was not perfect, but at least satisfied enough of the concerns that let us now go into the next year, and we'll start up again 1st of January. This will be a hot topic, and how we address this, I'm not entirely sure. I have some ideas, and I keep hearing from a lot of you on ideas that we should be working at, but making them responsible for infrastructure improvement in the right way, and where they are cutting to clean up after themselves, and not leave incredible fire damage. Because I remember a number of years ago when we were doing this, they cleared, and they said, oh, go through it, it looks fine. And I was walking through stuff, I don't have the shortest legs in the world, but I was walking through slash that was up to my knees, which is the first rung of the ladder if a fire is going to go through there, of the ladder fields. And that met the standards for how they were doing trimming and how they dealt with the slash. That's astonishing to me. It was then and it is now, when we're going to allow them to cut but leave enough materials that actually potentially exacerbates the fire danger. It makes no sense to me, especially when we have forests that don't function the way that they're supposed to function. Complex issue. These are the times when it would be nice to have Fred McPherson around to kind of talk about some of the science and things that work and don't work. Because otherwise without science, we're operating a little bit blind in the policy realm. But I know I am going to miss him. So that's probably a very long-winded way of wanting to start some big and some good news, some things that California is doing really well. And some struggles that we have been facing here for years with companies like PG&E, but in this realm, and with the amount of devastation, I worry about the knee-jerk reaction, I worry about overcompensating and ending up with solutions that, number one, don't work, and that cause other negative consequences in other contexts. And that's sort of what happens with a lot of the clearing that is going on here. So, with that, I'm happy to answer some questions. And are you going to give me the hook whenever we're...
I'll give you the hook, but can I be first on the question list?
Yeah. Who says no to Nancy, maybe?
What chance do we have of changing the leadership in the PUC? We have a new governor, and he appoints them to have some people with some sense controlling that.
There are a couple of them. I will admit, and I know this is going to be on tape, so but I was rather disappointed in this whole process with the chair of the PUC, who has a lot more authority than he's willing to exercise. There's a new appointee that I worked with quite a bit on water issues, and that's Martha Aceves-Guzman, who I've been talking to about this and a number of other issues around the district, and I like her a lot. And she's new and trying to figure out some things. So maybe we have a few folks, but yes, the governor, in fact, the biggest, I think we know Newsom is going to be similar to Brown in a lot of ways. In general, policies are going to continue. This is interesting, the first time in a generation or two that we've had a Democrat follow a Democrat into the gubernatorial office. And as Gavin is happy to point out, he is the first governor in decades that's not a Brown or a Brown staffer or somehow related to Brown, a Democrat. So he's completely on his own. He's very aware of all of this. But I think we know sort of in general how things are going to go. But what we don't know, and this is the part that I worry about, because it all is going to depend on who he puts into his key cabinet positions, who the Secretary of Natural Resources is going to be. It's not going to be John Laird, and I think he's going to retire. Matt Rodriguez is leading EPA. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, sort of one of my other big areas, that matters to me a lot. And he'll have some ideas on things, and he's already been communicative about some of those. And we're going to see a renewed emphasis on early childhood education and support for young families, which is absolutely fabulous, because that was, I think Jerry Brown was never a kid. Because those are some issues that he just doesn't understand as well. But Newsom has some young family, and these are issues that are important to him. So who fills these positions? And the PUC members serve at the pleasure of the governor, so they can be replaced anytime. But so it depends on those relationships, and we have a lot we're going to learn over the next 6 months about who he puts where and what he's going to be doing. So, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, these next few weeks are perhaps the most dangerous in terms of environmental policy for the next few years for the state, because precisely that, the appointments that are made, who's going to be the new Cali PA secretary, whether we're going to fix the dysfunctional toxics agency, fix the division of oil and gas, geothermal resources. These are largely captured agencies, captured by the industries that regulate. At the same time, it's a period where those same agencies are trying to push as much out the door as they can before the change in government. So what are you and your caucus able to do during this dangerous period? So it's not just a polluting interest in getting the ear of the incoming governor as to who these appointees should be, and how to keep an eye on the mischief that can be occurring at these agencies now.
Yeah, so the question is, and I didn't repeat Nancy's question, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember to do this, is we're in a bit of a transition time, which represents a little bit of risk, depending on an agency's desire or willingness to kind of push work through, waiting for the new administration. Because we're going from a Democratic administration to a Democratic administration, I have not seen any of that. In fact, most of the agencies are kind of, from what I've seen, hunkered down and just trying to see who their bosses are going to be. And it's not just the secretary and the department heads underneath that secretary, but there's a whole host of other political appointees who are there. They don't know if they're going to survive or not survive, so nobody knows who their bosses are going to be. And the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Regulation, which sort of always questioned the regulation, has actually seen a lot of change over the last number of years, and it's gotten a bit better because they have come a little bit further away from the industry. But this was the agency who, when I first landed up there in 2012, one of their persons who was worked for DOGGR, worked for the state agency, for an enforcement agency, had said, yeah, there's no fracking going on in California. And we all knew that to not be true. This person had to know that that was not true. But that person left very soon after that, which is a good thing. So we've seen some of the agencies come around, but I guess I'm a little bit less worried about what they do now as I am about who's going to be taking those positions. And that's a very kind of insider. Newsom has a kind of kitchen cabinet that he's built around him to make some recommendations. I know there are a lot of names that get rumored for this position or for that position. Usually the names that get mentioned first are not ever going to get considered, but it's hard to know. So we're trying to set it up in a way, or at least lend support to folks who we think are going to be helpful. But in the end, it's the governor's decision and the governor's decision only. And that's very jealously guarded. Somebody like, and we have yet to see with Newsom, of course, a number of us are weighing in, but with Jerry Brown, the more pressure he got from a particular sector about an individual often would guarantee that individual would not get the appointment. Because that was his decision, thank you very much, and his decision only. So yeah, we're going to learn a lot over the next 6 months. And there's some departments that I work with quite regularly that I am a bit worried about. And we will see what happens. We'll go to the back.
I attended the Santa Cruz County Fire State in October, and PG was there, and they said subsequent to all implementation clear, they were going to apply herbicides on all the rights of way, on all the roads in the county. And I haven't really been talking
No, so the question is, I guess PG&E had said that they're going to apply herbicides in there right away and on all the county roads?
Because obviously,
Well, they can't.
Again, I think they're going to have all these short hour fuels come up. And the state of all just said, hey, you're changing the microclimatic conditions, you're going to have a lot of grasses and brush come up, what are you going to do then? And they said, we'll just get into a routine herbicide application. And of course, working in a watershed that supports the lots of people. And because of those species, that's the problem.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. I had not heard that before, so we're going to follow up on that and see what they're thinking or what the response is, because we've worked so hard here to get away from some of the chemicals that have been sprayed, and we got the county years ago to not use Roundup on the vegetation management along the roadsides and all that, and to go backwards would be ridiculous. So yeah, we'll absolutely look at that.
Just comment on that. I have a video of somebody spraying some fluorescent green stuff along Graham Hill Road, and I took a video of it because I think that might be.
Well, some of that fluorescent green stuff is actually inert materials that just sort of hold the hillside in place and has seeds in it.
No,
so depending on whether it's hydroseeding, but yeah, it would be interesting to see that. But if they're spraying anything that's toxic in a wholesale manner, that's a problem.
Yeah, so I'll show you that video. But
Okay.
I also have a comment. Years ago, I was at a conference, it was an environmental conference, and was seated at a table for a keynote speech, and PG&E was there, and it happened to be the morning after the San Bruno explosion. And I was off grid, hadn't heard about it at all, and just sat there with this person who talked for an hour about how they were going to spin it to protect PG&E, and not until he got up to leave did someone mention how many lives were lost, and I was just floored and really taken aback by the fact that PG&E's corporate culture is very badly broken. That it was just like the whole concern was about how was PG&E going to spin this. And I think now we're seeing again, it's like a statewide recall on their infrastructure, and we're paying for it because they're going to just clear cut our trees and destroy our environment and our property values and our peace of mind. And so basically they're correcting their infrastructure problem at our expense. We're paying for the cutting, but we're also paying for it by losing our trees. So we have to push them to change their culture, but the best way for us to do that is for us to present what we expect of them and to flood the media with our cultural value that counteracts what they're doing, because it's just a big lie.
It is, and they are very self-protective, and this really bit them in the San Bruno explosion, San Bruno, Carmel, where they didn't even know where all the gas lines were. And I'm talking about lack of responsibility, and that just doesn't even cut it as a statement there. It was astonishing. And they were fined a lot, but I don't know how much they've learned. And that's the culture where they sort of take yes, it's at our expense, because a lot of this cutting then gets put into rate cases ultimately, and we all end up paying for it. But it's a little bit of money foolishly spent, because the long-term cost of not doing it right is going to exceed what we're having to address now.
Academic fees are increasing global warming. This makes no sense.
Yeah, especially when there are other solutions.
Could you define the solutions that San Diego is doing with the installation of the lines and the arc interrupting?
Yeah, there are better technologies for the lines with insulation. There are better switching systems that are not so old to be able to interact with or understand what's happening down the line. When they know that there's a potential threat in an area, they can de-energize certain lines strategically, but this also makes them need to look at what they're de-energizing, because you don't want to de-energize a line that has a police station or fire station at the end of it. But if this is an area of threat, yes, you can de-energize that line, but that means that they're going to have multiple paths to these important infrastructure pieces. And those are some of the things that SDG&E and others are looking at that PG&E so far has really refused to consider.
Well, there's the arc interrupter between the poles.
Yeah, so there are technologies. They have very old infrastructure. And there are ways that they could go and address that. I mean, it's just like when they were traipsing through here wanting to cut trees above all the areas where they thought they had gas lines. instead of running the technology through the lines to figure out where they were and what shape they were in. Again, they were taking the path of least resistance, most environmental detriment, when they had a better solution in front of them. And that got turned around because of public pressure, which was helpful.
So would it be better if they go bankrupt?
If they, so here's an interesting fact. They went bankrupt in the early 2000s because of the energy debacle. And because they did, rates went, we all paid for that. Rates went up through that. But this is what irks me, and this is what I have to keep reminding my colleagues. Before they were out of bankruptcy, so they were put into bankruptcy, it had all these implications. But before they were out of bankruptcy, they paid out $128 million in bonuses to their executives. So if they're going to go into bankruptcy, and if the state's going to bail them out, which I know is going to be a topic, I, for one, and I want your help on this, I want something for this. Because if they're going to, if they're going to expect the state taxpayers and ratepayers to bail them out for this, then we have to have a public say in their governance. If not, take that infrastructure and make it a public agency. I get to say stuff you guys understand. You know, I can hear people sort of shaking in Sacramento as I say that right now, because that's not what a lot of folks are going to want to do. But how can they expect us to bail them out and not have control over what they do? So that's just astonishing. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the SB 901 you mentioned, and I just hoping you'd say a little bit more about the limiting PG&E's liability and that's impact on the home fire insurance industry.
Okay, yeah, SB 901 does sort of two major buckets. And one is, for the first time, putting some greenhouse gas reduction funds to pre-positioning equipment and putting some money to force management. The fire chiefs, after the fires in 2017, we asked the fire chiefs, what would you need to avoid this? And they came to the legislature with a $100 million ask, which, if I have to write that check, I know it's a little astonishing, but in the States, that's an easy ask. $100 million worth of equipment to pre-position and using some predictive tools to understand where the dangers were, move that equipment there, so that as fires start, which they will start, right, they get addressed before they become major conflagrations. That makes sense. We didn't do that. But we did that's one of the components of SB 901. The other piece of it tries to deal with not the liability question, but how PG&E can start to have a conversation about shifting some of it from the shareholders and the ratepayers. And it's going to depend on a pretty difficult analysis of fault. Because right now, under the inverse condemnation, as is true for any public agency, the fault is not a question. If there's any fault, then the entire liability is borne by that agency. And again, this is a mechanism to get money out for communities to recover. So PG&E will now have, for the 2017 fires, will be a group kind of looking at their financial ability to sort of shift this and make recommendations on how much can be borne by the shareholders without driving the company into bankruptcy, and how much can legitimately be put into a rate case to then go to the PUC to talk about rates. For 2018, that's not the law. Nothing has changed from the old rules. 2019 going forward now gives the PUC some of the ability to do kind of that, is to look at how much fault there was, and for these major fires, not for the small ones, but for the major fires. Look at what the fault calculation was, and give the investor-owned utility the ability, instead of hitting all of showing their equity, to being able to put part of it in a rate case, especially if they weren't at fault. And so that's what we're looking forward to. So it's not, there's no taxpayer money, there's no bailout of the system. That is what they're asking for. They were not happy with this because they wanted us to just put some money. They wanted us to relieve them of liability in the first question, which a lot of my colleagues were willing to do, which was astonishing. And then they wanted us to bail them out. And again, we're not going to do that. And I'm hoping we'll have the fortitude to not do that, or if we do, unlike the federal government, to then have some appropriate level of control over their decision-making authority so that we don't get in that situation again. Because if PG&E, if there's no ability, and this is the insurance piece, if there's no ability to subrogate the insurance payments out to the homeowner who's been damaged, then insurance companies will be reluctant to start to write policies for fire insurance. And we saw that here. In fact, when I was on the board, we did the Urban Wildland Interface Code, which was one of the provisions of changing that. We got the way that the fire ratings happened, because there were a lot of people in the valley who were not going to be able to get fire insurance. But because the county took certain steps to help mitigate, using the building codes, to help mitigate some of that commitment then opened up the ability to get some fire insurance policy. Because there are a lot of people in these areas, and this was true in Santa Rosa, this has been true in other areas. Malibu is a little bit of a different story, because these are multi-million-dollar homes burning down, and those are typically better insured. But in all these other areas, and like in the fires we've had here, where a lot of people weren't necessarily insured. And so how do they recover if they don't have an insurance policy to go to, right? Because has been a deep pocket who has always been able to afford that, in this case the investor-owned utility, where there was any fault of the investor-owned utility in either the start of the fire or the exacerbation of the fire, then there was a means of recovery. Because we're talking about such large dollars now, we may end up in a situation where there's no longer means to recover. Then what? That's our responsibility collectively. And this was my comment about one of my colleagues saying, well, we should socialize the costs. And I just found that rather amusing, because I think there's an answer there. But, yeah. Kevin?
Well, thanks. Senator Jerry Hill has discussed the fact that the state has the authority to revoke PG&E charter to operate, and that the company could be broken up into regional utilities under public management. There's any hope that the legislature would take that up as a serious
So the question is, it's true that under the mechanisms we have, we could break up PG&E, force a breakup, because they operate under a public charter. Up to this point, and the question is would the legislature seriously entertain that? No. I think that's a non-starter. But as we try to figure out, this is what's going to be interesting about next year, as we try to figure out what all these implications of liability are, the bad actions of some IOUs, the good actions of other IOUs, those kinds of solutions start to become a real question. And this is sort of back to that public oversight, that if they want our help to backfill, we're going to have to come up with a mechanism to fill the gaps in what's not covered by insurance. So do what Florida did, or figure out some other mechanism